It's not mine. Better leave it alone. I wouldn't want to catch somebody's conservative cooties. Oh, did I say that on camera? No. Well, let's see here. Where were we? Oh, yes. Any questions? Midterm answers we'll discuss, well, either when your grade happens or just for final preparation. So just so you know, the midterm is the first half of the final. So if any questions you missed, you have an opportunity to correct later. Notice the wording was tricky, right? Okay, well, English is like that. Tricky. All right, is this right? Wait a minute, that's not the right one. Yeah. Okay. So if you recall this, yeah. I separated it out as the last slide if you picked up on the PowerPoints. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody else use this metaphor of psychogeometry, but since this is a counseling psychology class, it just gives you an idea of identity formation that's in a new way. So the idea that a experience is a point, similar experiences are like a line, then you could square those experiences and get a whole dimension within a particular framework, right? So in addiction, one's attention is focused on a single point or a single line to the exclusion of others. Usually, if it's a physical addiction, you're basically using to keep from getting, for example, in the example of opiates, dope sick. And that's your entire orientation. Acquiring the drug to keep from going into withdrawal, et cetera, et cetera. With video games, very similar. But your attention is basically focused on the electronic world and so on. Gambling, money, acquiring money, and using money to get more money, but ignoring the fact that you're in a process where it's designed to take your money legally. Probably be more honest to let yourself get mugged, but that's my value judgment. So I don't think that the conjugating the verb conscientiousizao is correct, conscientiocizaoing the inner identity cube, but the idea. So in psychogeometry, point is a thought or experience, a line is a collection of logically related points, like a line of reasoning. Well, remember what logic is. It's a means of reasoning to an answer. The answer doesn't have to be true. It just has to be consistent with the logic. Okay? So the logic of pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter drugs, you think that just because they're legal, they're safe. In all contexts. Right? If you're a civilian or a lay person or a patient. So for example, I was doing a presentation to athletes yesterday. So athletes get into addiction because of performance enhancement or pain management or recreating a winning experience. For example, Code Ayerla decided, oh, I'm not going to go to drug court. Well, you just sabotaged your going to the NFL. Because if you want to look like you screwed up. I mean, using Coke in a car. What are you, Jerry Garcia? Come on. People are going to notice that. At least, go in the bathroom or your own room or something, Basic street wisdom, right? So you got caught after you got kicked off the team. You want to go to the NFL? You better go to rehab, Don't be like no Amy Winehouse. Go to rehab. No. Don't play that. Because you want to enhance your chances. Because people want you to be contrite. But you don't do that, you don't do that. So the reason the whole thing with athletes is I had a young woman at Churchill who was a track athlete. And so she was a little tired, so she decided to take some Vivarin. Okay, so caffeine pills. So she took 7 of them. Why? Why not? Well, what it did is gave her heart palpitations. Right? And she was jittery, and she wound up performing worse, right? Because she figured, oh, well, if I take one, if I take one, then 7 must be 7 times as good, right? It should be safe, right? Because I bought it in a grocery store. That's the logic. The logic you can see is faulty. It ain't true. And she could have killed herself with 3 or 4 more. Now, it is news to people that you can kill yourself with caffeine. Yes, you can. The LD50 for caffeine is like 85 cups of coffee, which obviously, if you took it that way, you'd probably pee most of the caffeine out. I mean, how would you do 85 cups of coffee, right? You could easily do it in a pill, in a box of Vivarin. And the death is not nice. It's basically like liver failure, which is painful. It's not a heart attack. Which those aren't fun either, right? So when I'm saying about logic, means of reasoning to an answer. The answer doesn't have to be true, it just has to be consistent. And the logical principle here that I just explained was essentially, if it's a legal drug, it's safe to use in all contexts. No. But nobody tells you otherwise, right? So, therefore, your identity doesn't have to be true. That is what you experience optimally, but it can be constructed along the logic of society. In other words, consensus reality. So what we, in quotes, agree is real. Now, part of this thing about identity that I was talking about the other day is, for many of us, myself included, our identity is not chosen till later. Because the kid, a baby, basically, going along with the whole psychogeometry thing, you learn to walk, you learn to talk, there's people around you saying your name, saying who you are, teaching you to read or write, doing all those things, you take on this identity. All right? And you don't really start rebelling against that until like maybe teenager, which, when you start having raging hormones and questioning all these hairstyles and clothing and friends and all, rebelling against your parents, you don't start taking on other identities. Doesn't occur to you to do that unless something's wrong and you sense something's wrong. So in consensus reality, we agree what's real. So consensus reality is a construct of reference, that is, psychological and other subjective and objective experiences we agree are real. Now, who is the we? Identities can be constructed along lots of different lines depending on who you identify with and what your experience is. If you were raised not by wolves, but by biker gangs, that reality is real for you. If you were raised by street gangs, if you're a mafia family, and I'm not just talking about crime, I'm talking about, other alternative identities that basically are not necessarily depicted on TV. I'm not talking about Sons of Anarchy or whatever. I'm just saying, who is the we, right? Different people have different realities, right? That's duh. But we don't necessarily think about that. So, for example, race may be an illusion with no scientific factual basis, but it does have a political reality. President Mary Spildy is from Scotland. But a century ago in New York City, Scots weren't considered people. In America, they were not considered equal Americans. They were immigrants, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal. Right? So gender has a definite reality, as does class. So is PMS real? Well, the men don't experience it unless they're, in a relationship with a woman who said, this is putting up with men's stuff. Don't bug me, or whatever, Is PMS real? Not to male scientists. Not according to male psychiatrists. No, y'all are crazy. That's why we need to put you on heroin. That was policy in this country. Yes. Actually, it wasn't, Valium is one, but Valium is not really useful in pregnancy. It's not a good idea.
Like after,
yeah. But it's still going to get in the breast milk. Yeah. But again, male doctors are not going to think like that, right? Because remember, these are the same folks that were giving women PCP during labor. Remember that story? Great. Yeah, that was, when pregnancy is a disease. Only a man could think like that. I'm just saying. Right? So and that was the medical consensus. Scary, right? So racism real, depends on who you ask. All right, so the identity box, it's constructed. And it's basically along the lines that society talks about or doesn't talk about. So part of the reason, you're cursed with having me as a teacher, I say, look, you need to find out where this came from and question it. Then you can accept it if you want to, but you might want to change to something else. So those identities. So those constructed identities, because remember race, gender, and class, sexual orientation, age, ability, addiction, etc. I mean, you can put your own 6 categories on the cube faces as it relates to you. But let's say that those become your core identity. Your identity box has been shaped for you by addictive society. Now, the reason I like psychogeometry is I'm saying, okay, this is the inner red cube is the identity that has been shaped by society that you may or may not have questioned. And if you didn't question it, basically you accept it and not necessarily realize that the structure around the red cube is called the hypercube, a 4-dimensional hypercube. So you might not necessarily see that there is an invisible structure imposing that identity on you. That's unquestioned, unless, why is this? Where did this come from? Who decided that, pick a characteristic. Okay, pick a characteristic of those 6 that I just named. Okay. Who decided, first of all, so class is about, and this is defined in college, in economics, as socioeconomic status. All right, so first it's college that's defining that. So whether it's sociology or econ, they'll take a different view of it, all right? So socioeconomic status is seen as an intersection between education, occupation, and status in society, which you could read power and influence. Okay, so you may not know, okay, so socioeconomic status, so the more degrees you have, potentially the more money you make, right? Your occupation, et cetera, et cetera. So in intersectionality, did you know also that the whole concept of marketability is not only education, occupation, not only socioeconomic status, but it also could be how you look. Hygiene, hair color. As an example, the front office look, blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm not making that up. So where did blonde hair and blue eyes come in as a standard for the front office look? Well, if you go, depending on how far you go back, I mean, I can answer that, but that's mostly rhetorical. There's a dangerous book called The History of White People, written by a black woman from Yale. And she basically goes to Europe, translates where these ideas came from. And so she says, okay, for example, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed standard of beauty, which we agree this is a standard of beauty, right? Marketability, front office look, et cetera, et cetera. She said where that came from? Slaves. Slaves who were captured by other Europeans and sold to the rich guys who happened to be black guys and had harems for harems. And they prized blonde hair and blue eyes. What? Wait a minute. You serious? And so that's kind of cut off from what we think today. But that's where that came from. And she said then that got reinforced as a standard of beauty globally. That's why globally there are skin lightening creams and people changing their hair color and people getting blue-eyed non-corrective contact lenses to emulate that style of beauty. Not just here in America, but in the third world too. Becoming marketable. Look who's a movie star. Look who's not, et cetera, et cetera. Look who they use in advertising. Who's the spokesperson? Right? So, I mean, I'm not saying that blonde-haired, blue-eyed people are not attractive. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, where did that standard come from? And then pick another, right? So class is good, right? So in terms of class, because when we think of classism, then rich, poor. And then we have this middle class who theoretically were poor and were able through their education to move out of the poor class into the middle class, but not quite rich. Right? Which is the idea, that's why what I was saying the other day about college being the means by which the poor can attain middle class status, and that the view of college is middle class. Like you're supposed to sit here, quietly absorb, ask questions, all that kind of stuff. Not do crosstalk. Who set that up? Pick another characteristic. Gender. Okay, so gender's often about roles. Who can do what? Where? What's a boy's job? What's a girl's job? What's a man's job? What's a woman's job? A woman's place is in the home, barefoot and pregnant. Not my family. But where did those roles come from? And those roles had shifted. Certainly not in slavery. I mean, I do recommend 12 Years a Slave, because you'll see, women actually picking more cotton than the men. Cotton ain't fun. There's thorns and stuff. Anyway, the idea about gender roles, those are constructed. By who? And then what happens when you break those rules? Can a woman dress like a man? Can a man dress like a woman? People start tripping when you start crossing those boundaries. And so why are those boundaries in existence? So part of that, gender. All these things are constructed. We don't necessarily look at the history of where those things came from unless your culture is already oriented to doing that. So I'm suggesting, you should kind of take the option while you have it, not just here in this class, but generally in life, to question that. So your identity box has been shaped for addictive society for particular ends that may or may not be to your interest. And the reason I use this particular hypercube, notice that it's not symmetrical, it's distorted. One side is bigger than the other. Right? For a reason. To illustrate, what society does is kind of emphasize certain traits over others, and that might not be healthy for you. Also, you could also take this to be, in addiction, you might be focusing on the physical and your body more than others, to the detriment of, your psychological, spiritual, and emotional health as well. Okay? So your identity box can be distorted. So again, to begin to look and question those things that you kind of took for granted is a useful skill. Particularly when, not only looking at your own stuff and when basically selecting a new identity that's non-addictive, but if you're dealing with relatives or children. As a preference, as a drug counselor, I often liked working with youth more than adults. Because youth, I've only been using for 5 years, I can quit. And adults, I've been slamming dope for 25 years, I can't stop now. Die then. It's not like that, but I know. I'm just being real here. Fine, throw yourself in front of a bus. See what I can. No, but one of the things you can do with adults that you can't do with adolescents is adults have a more set and stable identity. Adolescents are still forming it. So that's why it's easier to deal with them, because, I can select that as a choice. So I had dinner with the son of one of my clients from high school, who essentially raised himself and the other kids because his parents were dealers and using, etc., etc. He said, I'll tell them I saw you. You don't have to. Glad you turned out okay. All right. So, using this idea, higher dimensions can help you reshape your identity. Now, the nice thing is that you already exist in these higher dimensions, you just didn't know it yet. You're already there. If you can conceive it, you're already there. Even if it's difficult for you to conceive, because you haven't been practiced at doing it. Einstein once said that imagination is more important than intelligence. So what I mean by higher dimensions can also mean other different points of view from other places outside of what you've been told is normal. Things that are normal elsewhere. Part of the reason you have me is because of Mrs. Yodelay. I want to be a marine biologist. Did I tell you guys that? Yeah, I want to be a marine biologist. Because of Flipper. The original Flipper. You know? Because, I went to high school in West LA, from living in South Central. When we did school, we'd go surfing. We'd go surfing at Zuma Beach. There's dolphins. Wow, what are those? Besides marine land and all that kind of stuff. SeaWorld. And there was this cat that was really into dolphin intelligence. His name was John Lilly. And one of the things that he figured out is that dolphins were as intelligent, if not more intelligent, than humans. And so he kind of felt it was unethical to teach them to be able to retrieve bombs and stuff like that for the Navy. So he got out of dolphin research and went into LSD research. And I followed him into that. And that's how I got into this. Okay, how do drugs affect your consciousness? And then how do you replace drugs to change your consciousness? How do you change your consciousness without drugs? To achieve the same effect that's lasting. That's what I'm saying, the higher dimension thing. Drugs can't necessarily show you anything that isn't there already. You just have to have the perceptual set to be able to see it or perceive it. So in 10-dimensionals, this is 10-dimensional hypercubes are just to understand that. So when we look at the whole concept of crash and look at up to 10 different characteristics besides class, race, gender, addiction, ability, age, etc., religion, occupation, etc., then all those things can combine in terms of shaping or reshaping your identity. So, for example, a basic square, so if you just assume the normal consensus reality conversation along those particular lines, then add another dimension to each one of them. So you add more depth through experience. And this is why, for example, when Paulo Freire was talking about learner teachers, these are the people who learned life lessons through the school of hard knocks. And he's saying their experience is just as valid as those of us who went through college but didn't learn particularly the same life lessons that you learn on the street. And that's one of the things in training addictions counselors. You can't train street wisdom. Can't. But you don't necessarily have to be a drug dealer to learn about addiction either. Simple recovery, simple abstinence, and going to years and years of 12-step meetings does not necessarily make you powerful either. It does help. All right, so you can gain experience. and in natural mind. So the idea behind this graphic then is once you are able to understand the forces that have shaped your identity, the influences that have shaped your identity, you can start editing and then replacing and creating an identity that, whoops, come back. Where I'd suggest you start pushing back and saying, well, pick a, let's take classism. So for me, a higher class person is a person who gives wisdom to others, valuable life lessons to others. And it doesn't matter how rich they are. Like some of you may have heard of Eckhart Tolle. So he was homeless. Bum sleeping on a park bench. Then suddenly becomes, not suddenly, but you know, if you've read his stuff, kind of heady, but you know, it's real for what it is. I've met people like that on the road. There's one particular guy that I met after a rainbow gathering, so yes, I have been a black hippie, so whatever. Anyway, this guy, we're hitchhiking in Wyoming, where you can't actually stick your thumb out. And his actual way of hitchhiking was standing by the side of the road waving at people. And so we're going from Rock Springs to Salt Lake City. And the people that stop to pick us up are like ranchers who say in 5 minutes, I've never picked up anybody. So, you know, here's this black hippie with a backpack and a cowboy hat. This guy wearing a raggedy shirt and raggedy jeans, no shoes, with his box of puppies. And this rancher picks us up. And in 5 minutes, the rancher is telling this guy his life story. And then takes us farther than where he was going, and then, you know, can I pray with you? Yeah. And then lets us go. And then the next ride was like that. Who is this guy? I mean, having these crusty people open up their hearts to him, like, I mean, it was amazing to watch that. I called him a road Christ, because that was a trip. And he said, you can do that too, which I did, from up into Canada and back down to California, hitchhiking that way. And the longer I waited, the more likely it was for me to get a ride exactly where I was going in one ride, without hitchhiking. So I know it's possible in terms of, oh, you see it done. Okay, so wisdom raises you in my class. But that's my cultural belief as a native and as an African. Elders have wisdom, and wisdom is money. Wisdom is better than money. The ability to unite people across differences, that's royal. Not political power, not money. Because rich people don't necessarily know how to do that. Some do. Right? So I had to construct that identity to be able to replicate that professionally. That can't necessarily be taught in a book. It's outside the book. But by telling you it's a possibility, oh, well, maybe I could do that. How do you do that again? How do you create a counter-gender role that's uniquely you, but then is also expansive? Or a class role, or... Right? So for example, since I'm often talking to people so to talk about spirit, this is actually, so spirit is the real experience of connection to something greater than yourself. referred to in at least two ways, in English anyway. The silent, compassionate witness and the still, small voice within. Now, I've seen biblical references for these, but these aren't just Christian. So the silent, compassionate witness is basically, it's watching. Well, it's not it, it's you. But you don't necessarily identify with it all the time. But it's always watching. There's some part of you that's always watching. That's always on, even in a blackout. Preferably you don't have to experience it in a blackout. Hopefully you don't experience blackouts anymore. But the silent, compassionate witness. So when you're in compassionate, what it means, it's going through the experience with you, but from a place that's removed so that you could actually tune into it and learn something. And then the still small voice within. So that you can experience as your own personal intuition. It's always true and correct. You should have listened. Something told me. I knew I should. Okay, so listen to that. Maybe I shouldn't do that. So we deal with this a lot, especially, with addicts, where no becomes no K. So intuition is also the voice of the inner teacher if we're using Angie Arian's framework. So the prefix EM means within. Power is the capacity to be effective, and ment means mind. So empowerment. So kind of what we're talking about is empowerment. Power within mind. So addiction makes you focus on things outside of yourself. Empowerment means there's inner resources that you can become aware of and develop to change. So your book that talks about willpower is not enough. Well, okay, if we had a culture that actually said, okay, this is what your will is, and these are the weights you need to leave, or the laps you need to run to develop willpower, then that would be fine. If we had a willpower gym or something. Well, we don't necessarily in society. You just have a lack of willpower. Okay, well, what is will? That may change depending on, the framework that you're working with. All right, so intuition is the voice of the inner teacher. And the inner teacher is also part of you, too. So each one of you, not only within the Freirean framework, but in the framework that I'm breaking down, it's like you're potential teachers of this stuff by practicing it. Making mistakes, learning from your mistakes if your mistakes aren't fatal. But even if they are, come back next time. Well, that's in my framework anyway. So, the matrices of domination within Crash. So we haven't talked about Crash in depth yet, correct? I've defined it, but not breaking it down yet. Okay. So, when society imposes an identity, you can choose a different one and push back. So, sometimes that identity has been internalized and been made unconscious. And sometimes you can be exposed to other options in identity. So in any case, a balance is achieved where the inner world remains unchanged, regardless of what happens to the outer world. The outer world can be influenced on this term that I'm using, satyagraha. It literally, it's from Sanskrit. It means holding on to truth, holding on or grasping truth. So it's the way of Gandhi, Howard Thurman, who is Martin Luther King's teacher, and Martin Luther King. So basically, it's a spiritual response to transform an oppressive situation, non-violently. And what it requires is that you change from within, regardless of what's happening outside. Sometimes in response to what's happening outside. Because sometimes that can be violent, depending on who or what you are, that you've chosen as an identity. Now, I was choosing this as a framework because one of the things that I had found is that until 1956, when alcoholism was defined as a disease, alcoholics were treated as criminals unless they had money. Then they could buy treatment, which was basically non-scientific and ineffective. Like, for example, the medical doctor that founded Johns Hopkins Medical School was a cocaine addict. Okay? I mean, like I told you about Freud. So lots of doctors, this was before the concept of addiction had been invented as a concept. So they thought nothing of, the hypodermic needle had been invented, a decade or so before, so they thought nothing of shooting cocaine. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, the 7% solution, 7% solution of cocaine. Quick, Watson, the needle. I mean, they're writing about this stuff, right? And so we think that's insane, but right, heroin was in over-the-counter cough syrup, cocaine was in Coca-Cola. This was just the way they did this kind of stuff, right? But once they made that stuff illegal, so the head of Johns Hopkins was a cocaine addict. So his friend said, no, this is out of hand. They took him on a Caribbean cruise to dry him out. Then when he comes back, he's self-administering morphine for the rest of his life until he died. Yes, I'm saying he was a junkie. Now, this is also before we had a code of ethics that said a physician that treats himself as a fool for a patient. So maybe you shouldn't be self-administering morphine to yourself and treating patients in surgery. I mean, I'm just saying. Right? But that was normal because he was in the upper class and therefore shielded from the consequences of his actions. But if you're not there, you lose your job, they throw you in the drunk tank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? No treatment applied at all. So that's what I'm saying. When society evolves to the level of being compassionate, it's a civil rights issue for you to fight for that. How long did it take for women to get the vote? I'm not commenting about the women's state of dress here, but I remember a time in middle school where it was illegal for girls to wear jeans. Okay, that's the 60s. Know why? Oh, I couldn't wear Levi's either. Know why? That was gang attire. What gang? James Dean. You've seen the movie. What's he dressed in? Levi's. White t-shirt, that was considered juvenile delinquent dress. Had a dress code. Girls had to wear dresses, no pants. So that's why, I'm talking about, those are the era, that was what we were fighting against in coming for the 18-year-old vote. in middle school, when we were fighting for that in middle school. That's what we were dealing with, too, that kind of mindset. So I'm saying all this to say, in terms of looking at your health and well-being, sometimes as a civil rights issue, sometimes you have to fight for that without any validation from society, especially if it's an addictive process and you're trying to be in recovery from it. So discipline is to follow an inner teacher. It often helps to have an outer teacher as a role model, but it's not necessarily required. Because sometimes you might be the first person to do this. Not always likely, but sometimes. So discipline is to follow and develop your own inner teacher. So how the teacher teaches, using examples and their style, is as important, maybe more important than the content. So in the midterm, where there's tricky language used, I'm not trying to trip you up. I'm just trying to teach you by example that precision of language can be critical. So pay attention to that. I mean, I'm presuming we're all native English speakers, right? But I can't always assume that. Because it is definitely within linguistics that if your grandmother was not a native English speaker, you don't process English like a native speaker. So, the 5 cultural views of addiction piece, which we glancingly talked about. So the first one was addiction as sin, willful misbehavior. Okay, that's coming from the worldview of a certain form of Christianity. Sin, willful misbehavior. You know it's right, but you ain't doing it. The devil made you do it. So the solution is to punish the addict. Now, this had a class analysis. If you're poor, you get thrown into the drunk tank. If you're rich, you get thrown into the hospital. Addiction as disease. The solution, treat the addict with 12-step based treatment. 90 meetings in 90 days. We'll treat the street drugs and alcohol, but ignore coffee, cigarettes, and your diet. Not all of them. There are some treatment programs that don't allow sugar, but do allow coffee and cigarettes. Now, there is a medical basis for this, certainly. Street drugs and alcohol will kill you quicker. Cigarettes take 20 years, so certainly there is some justification in basically kicking the more lethal stuff first. And then once you've got some stabilization going, go for the harder, longer kick of nicotine. Sometimes that's articulated, but I'm obviously being forbidden to work in a treatment context except at Whitebird. I'm basically saying, well, 12-steppers, I'm a normie, so I'm into the science. So justify something scientifically. But if you can't, that makes them uncomfortable. And if you call them on that, that makes it uncomfortable too. So, see, you're cursed with me. So, addiction, maladaptive behavior. The solution is treat and teach the addict pro-social adaptive behaviors and skills. This usually means emotional cognitive skills, emotional identifying emotions, cognitive skills, basically identifying your thinking patterns, which often take time and are best done one-on-one, though the preferred method of doing this is often in group, anger management group, cognitive behavioral therapy group, motivational interviewing as a technique. So in this worldview, and this basically this is the first three things that we usually teach to professionals. So first, it was addiction is sin. We throw you in a jail, you're willfully misbehaving. We actually still do that. Why? Because some people's medical... So understand, all addictions are in the province of the medical field. They're medical conditions, medically defined. But not everybody's problem gets treated as if it's a medical problem. Some people get excused. The Lindsay Lohans. Okay, so there's a class piece, there's a gender piece, there's a race piece in that, as opposed to, say, like a Wesley Snipes. Really? You're throwing him in jail for tax evasion? Or whatever. Coke addiction? Or you're throwing rappers in jail because, well, they got money, so what's up with that? Anyway, right? So there's double, triple, quadruple, multiple standards depending on who you are. There's a whole matrix within that. There's supposed to be no difference in the eyes of the law, but actually what happens is people get treated differently. Inside it, who gets into treatment, who doesn't get into treatment, who persists, who doesn't. Addiction is disease basically started in '56 when the AMA said that alcoholism is a disease. Now notice that this is after 12 steps had been in existence since the late 30s. Still took them like almost 20 years to say that alcoholism is a disease. And then push for that so that there's going to be regular forms of treatment. So notice in the solution, if the solution is treating the addict with 12-step based treatment, and one of the bases for success in 12-step based treatment is belief in the higher power, the science crowd don't like that. Because that sounds quasi-religious. How much higher power can you fit in a bottle? How do you measure this higher power? And it doesn't matter that, within the 12-step community, they basically say, look, higher power can be your group. It can be your teddy bear. It can be anything. You define it yourself. It doesn't have to be God or whatever. Well, the science crowd ain't down with that. This behavior done this way, the X amount of times produces this result. In the laboratory, first time, every time, whether you believe it or not. That's the gold standard, replicability, right? So that's why they're believing in with pro-social adaptive behaviors. So that question on the midterm, anybody got a copy of it? Thanks. Tricky language. And you got it right. When addiction is a maladaptive behavior, it is a learned behavior. Educate the addict. Now, people frequently answer B, the addict improperly learned healthy behaviors. So because I've shown you, where does society teach you healthy behaviors except in prohibition? They don't. Right? So that's tricky, but I'm just saying, right, it's easy to think that. That makes sense logically. Oh, you improperly learned healthy behaviors. Oh, you're supposed to brush your teeth for 2 minutes, right? And then floss. Well, how many people do that? Okay, don't out yourself, but I'm saying, how many people do that? So if I just do 30 seconds, the uppers or lowers, and just skip that, is that improperly learning healthy behaviors? or non-compliance? So you don't have to answer that. It's rhetorical, right? So in this worldview, they're basically taking into account society ain't teaching you healthy behaviors. They're not. There's no place that actually teaches them. We don't do relationship school. We don't do, drug taking school. We don't do any of that stuff. Crazy, but hey. All right, so all these all these therapies that come out of the third worldview, the scientific worldview, they take time. But we ain't got time, and you ain't got no money, so here's these pills, which, by the way, might have side effects which may make it difficult to learn or practice the skills, which we ain't got time to teach you, so, oh, look, it's the holidays coming up. Oh, our time is over. Right? So that's the situation we're in now, right? Where, my dad would say he was trained to deliver counseling on a 50-minute hour without pills, but now the state makes him see people for 15 minutes. And all you can do is med management. He's forced into that even though he has the skills. He would maintain, he's the only person trained to have those skills. I'm saying, no, Dad, some of us got that stuff without the drugs. So pills ain't skills. I like that. Chip off the old block, okay? All right, so the two non-Western views, and the reason I mention these is because they're out there and people are participating in them, even white people. Addiction is life out of balance. Koyaanisqatsi is the word that I use. It's a Hopi word. There's 13 different translations into English, and I'm only using the first 5. A crazy life. Life in turmoil. Life disintegrating. Life out of balance. A state of life that calls for another way of living. But notice this ain't a value judgment, they're just telling the truth. It's a crazy life you're living. Yeah, I agree. My life is falling apart. I need to live in a different way. Life out of balance. So if they have a word for it, they must have experienced it and found a way out of it and then integrated it into their culture. So that's why I'm talking about this whole thing about culture. Maybe you didn't learn to do this from your culture. Maybe you should reform it in resistance to what your culture has said or not said. So the solution in this framework is cultural practices that restore a spiritual balance and right relationship to natural processes. So for example, tobacco as a sacrament versus tobacco as an addictive and as addiction. So within Indian country, we basically say there's an addictive use of tobacco and there's a sacred use of tobacco, and they're not the same. In their traditional use of tobacco is used only for prayer. You don't inhale. No inhalation, no coughing, no addiction. And by the way, you ain't praying every 5 minutes. You pray maybe once a day. Maybe the beginning and maybe 3 times at the most. But, you're praying with other folks. Teepee medicine meeting. So that's referring to basically using, in the Native American church, whichever branch you're participating in, basically using peyote as a sacrament. But this isn't to get high, even though it is a psychedelic, because, and Americans who do this, because they'll let you. But a teepee meeting is you go in at sunset and you sit there eating the medicine. You have a pee break at midnight and then you sit until dawn. This ain't getting high. A lot of Americans are not into that, right? Because peyote makes you throw up, even if it is a psychedelic. And that's ritualized as part of the context, saying, this is medicine, medicine is bitter, and what you're throwing up is some of the things that you need to get rid of anyway. And we'll help you through that, and you sing songs and do the stuff that you do as part of the experience. What you experience is part of the experience. And so in terms of efficacy in alcoholism, since in Western medicine, mescaline is not an addictive drug taken that way, yeah, it would be effective for alcohol treatment within a native context. So also within this worldview, which is why there's a comma after meetings, the little smoke as an ally versus countercultural Prozac. Okay, the little smoke by its Spanish name, marijuana. So within some native nations, like for example the Lakota, the only person that was allowed to smoke that was the medicine person, and only to seek vision for other people. So it's acknowledging that it's a powerful medicine, but it's not used for other folks. Also, I should also say, with the TP meetings, those are considered prayer meetings for the healing of a particular person within the community. That's when they have them. So it's not about, again, not even close to about getting high. Somebody needs healing, we'll have a meeting for them. They may or may not be in the meeting. But the energy generated with the medicine is used to focus prayers for them. Same thing with the little smoke. Now that's just the Lakota. There are other folks, because remember, this is a weed, grows planet-wide, so different people have different practices and beliefs with it. But Rastafarianism, for example, is not about smoking ganja. There are Rastas that don't smoke ganja. Pointedly so. Muda Baruka, for example. But if you don't know who that is, that's okay. He's in iTunes. Versus countercultural Prozac, which, the movement, the movement to create medical marijuana. Yes, lots of cultures have used that particular substance as medicine. But in our 21st century context, the solution to medicine can't be smoke more buds. Sorry, that's not scientific. So the fifth one came out of African American culture. Addiction is weapon. Also, addiction is slavery. And basically it comes from the worldview that acknowledges that addiction to legal and illegal drugs is profitable, just like slavery was. And that there are social practices that maintain its presence and support it. Now, obviously, it's not just African Americans that can see that. But we definitely willing to say that out loud and on camera. So, the solution within that worldview is active, spiritually based resistance against the ism-based cultures, which promote addiction, codependency, promote self, cultural, historical, spiritual, and interpersonal knowledge, skills, and abilities, which develop self-sufficiency, interdependency, cultural proficiency, economic and political independence. That's recovery, not just recovery from the physical substance, but recovery as a holistic human being. Because your use or your addiction just hasn't affected you physically. And in order to really respond to it effectively, the only word that we have for it in English is spiritual, which that's why I basically defined it that way. Connection is something greater. Higher dimension, if you want to call it that, but I don't suggest that it is a higher dimension. I suggest that it's part of you. You're not used to using it. So part of the piece within this particular framework is basically saying that within what we'll call crash or intersectionality, that there's inter-relational systems that promote addiction and also codependency. So for example, in this worldview, this is the worldview that allows me to say that, for example, certain types of isms are co-occurring disorders. Now, usually we don't use that word until the pro class, but I'm throwing it out here because you've observed the phenomenon. Okay? Co-occurring disorders simply means you have a mental illness and an addiction simultaneously. Now, certain drugs, for example, if people are in a bipolar cycle up and down, meth produces that. Produces the high, you crash, low, high, get high to go up. That's a bipolar cycle. You're manic, then depressive. Manic, depressive. Manic for 3 weeks, depressed. Right? Now, was that there before the drug? Or did the drug induce it? And in co-occurring disorder, again, pro class, doesn't matter. One of the medical protocols is to say, we need you to stop using street drugs, not simply because they're illegal, but because you don't know the dosage and the potency. There's no quality control, even if your cook is scrupulous. We don't know what's in it. Here, take these drugs from Big Pharma, which at least we have quality control. So the idea is, okay, how do we know which came first, the chicken or the egg? The mental illness or the addiction? Well, that depends. Okay? I have lots of clients, and you've written in your social recons too, right? Kids who are scripted with Ritalin or Adderall, right? If you understand, Adderall is pharmaceutical meth. Oh, and all of a sudden, when medical science says they're supposed to age out of it after puberty, and they feel like they don't feel normal unless they're on some kind of speed. Did the medical profession induce that addiction? They will say they didn't. But I've talked to lots of clients whose conviction is, I got this way and I started using because I needed to feel normal. And only meth could do that, except that it spiraled out of control. So certain drugs, and so street meth as opposed to Adderall. Adderall is not so nice to you either. Meth is like taking brain cancer. It's brain cancer, literally. Causes physical changes. So it can induce psychosis while you're on it, and certain amounts of that psychosis might remain, depending on the person. So the medical protocol with co-occurring disorders was basically get them off of street drugs, stabilize them with pharma. If the mental health symptoms disappear in, say, 3 to 6 months, or if they clear after the detox, after about a month, then it was the drugs that caused it. If they don't clear, then maybe it was there before, which I'm sorry, that might be the state of the art, but that's kind of ambiguous. That's where we are. So co-occurring disorders, the reason I went on that bird walk is within the African American community, we consider systemic discrimination like racism a co-occurring disorder. It's like an addiction and a mental illness. And so it's hard to give up, especially if you have privileges in that particular thing. So not just, originally the construct was developed for racism, but, wow, sexism? I can't have you if nobody can have you? What kind of crack-eyed idea is that? Woman is property? What? Children are property? What? Where'd that come from? I own you, classism, you're my employee, etc. Right? So part of the piece then is how do you find a solution from that? Let's see, that shouldn't have been duplicated. That shouldn't have been duplicated. Here we go. Right. So for example, within the Native community, the Wellbriety movement. So going back in history, Natives have resisted the effects of alcohol in Native societies and cultures from early in the European arrival on Turtle Island. So for example, Handsome Lake, who was a Seneca in the area that is now upstate New York, began to teach about alcohol recovery following his own successful sobriety and recovery from the effects of alcohol. And so key among this is practice of certain elements that pre-existed American addictive society that are part of Native culture. Among those, the teepee meetings, et cetera, the Wellbriety movement. So there's also not saying that sobriety is a key to recovery, but general wellness in a holistic sense is part of your recovery too. So for example, when you go to that website, White Bison, their book, Red Road to Wellbriety, History of Resistance to Alcohol. So both sober and well. Live the well part means to live the healthy parts of the principles, laws, and values of traditional culture. Means to heal from a dysfunctional behaviors other than chemical dependency, including codependency, adult children of alcoholic behavior, domestic or family violence, gambling, and other shortcomings of character within that particular framework. So comprehensive, holistic, and culturally specific. And those meetings aren't necessarily closed to people who might check the box as white, but basically between this one particular framework and within this African American framework where addiction is slavery, to free yourself from addiction when many addictions are legal like slavery was, you have to start with your unresolved pain. Within our construct, when we talk about post-slavery stress disorder, that is 300 years of slavery plus another 150 years of legal segregation has produced epigenetic effects. That's why you got that paper, because the science shows it's not just with us, it's everybody that's had trauma. So basically what happens is that society promotes ignorance of your own cultural, that's what I mean by indigenous, healing knowledge, and promote external maladaptive behavior as normal, and that's probably what society does. But in order to realize that, you have to develop a framework that causes you to automatically question what society does to you and find another pattern. So that's why I'm using those two non-Western views of saying, okay, not everybody, the first three approaches ain't working with everybody. So this is working with us, and we haven't been allowed to get into the larger treatment system. If it works with us, maybe it can work with some other folks too. Just saying. So I will leave up, end the lecture here and leave up the rest of the things for your perusal. So you can roll music now. Thank you. Turn in your midterms if you haven't.
online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.